Would you leave your child in the care of a religious school if you knew that behind those walls, children were being beaten, humiliated, and silenced? This story is not fiction. It happened, and for more than a century. In the quiet town of Clonmel, Ireland, there was a school that promised to save young people at risk. Its name was St. Joseph's Industrial School. But what was hidden inside was a true system of horror, supported by those who were supposed to protect them, religious people who used faith as a shield and silence as a weapon. Between prayers and punishments, hundreds of children were subjected to physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. And the most revolting thing? All of this was covered up. Silent transfers, files manipulated. What kind of faith is this that destroys in the name of salvation? Today you will learn the dark details of the case that became known as one of the biggest scandals of the Catholic Church in Ireland. Get ready, because what happened between those walls still leaves scars, and not everyone made it out alive. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and share this video with anyone who needs to know how far institutional abuse can go. Because telling these stories is a way of never allowing them to happen again. The building was imposing, with its grey stone facade and carved crosses above the tall gates. Located in Clonmel, a quiet town in Ireland, St. Joseph's Industrial School operated as a Christian institution focused on fostering vulnerable children. Since 1887, boys from all over the region, children of poor families, orphans, or simply considered difficult, were sent there with the promise of a rigorous and, above all, moral education. To the public, the school was a symbol of charity and discipline. But for those who lived inside, the reality was different. Upon arrival, the boys had their names written down in notebooks and their clothes changed into simple uniforms. From that moment on, they ceased to be individuals and became just another number in the system. The cold hallways and silent classrooms hid a routine marked by absolute obedience. Any sign of rebellion was punished with severe physical punishment. Some were beaten with canes, others were forced to kneel for hours on stone floors. The brothers, as those in charge were called, commanded respect, not with love, but with fear. The school was run by the Christian Brothers, a Catholic congregation known for its work in educational institutions. However, official documents would later reveal that many of these men had a history of violent and abusive behavior. Instead of being removed, they were simply quietly transferred to other facilities. The cycle repeated itself. The protection of the church seemed to outweigh the right of the children to live without pain. And so, year after year, new victims arrived, and old traumas were buried in silence. Few visits were allowed. Parents who tried to follow their children's routine were discouraged or received evasive answers. The closed structure and religious authority were perfect shields against any denunciation. For the boys, running away was not an option, and telling what was happening was even more dangerous. After all, who would believe the word of a rebellious child over that of a man of God? Thus, the suffering was camouflaged under a semblance of order. And while prayers echoed in the morning, the screams remained muffled at night. It was common to see the boys walking in a line, eyes downcast, not speaking to each other. Silence was more than a rule. It was armor. In the hallways of St. Joseph's, those who talked too much were punished. Those who cried were humiliated. The fear was so deep that it became a habit. There was a kind of non-verbal code among them, warning glances, subtle gestures, the holding of breath when they heard heavy footsteps approaching. Many of the boys didn't even know what affection was. The only form of touch they knew was pain. Some of the brothers presented themselves as pious figures. They organized masses, taught passages from the Bible, and spoke about sin and redemption. But when night fell, the same people who preached Christian love beat them with belts, insulted them, locked the boys in dark rooms, or forced them to sleep on the floor. The contrast was cruel. The same hand that offered the body of Christ in the morning dragged a child by the collar in the afternoon. And within that environment, the most vulnerable were the preferred targets, those who had no one outside of school to defend them. There were reports of screams, but no neighbor ever questioned them. The high gates, covered windows, and social reverence for the church formed a perfect shield against suspicion. When a boy disappeared from the routine, whether due to illness, punishment, or worse, the explanation was always vague. He was transferred, they said. Too unruly. No one dared ask more questions. Not even the staff felt safe. The religious hierarchy made everyone fearful of retaliation. Silence was the rule. Silence was survival. Years later, in testimonies collected by official commissions, former students described chilling scenes. But the most shocking thing was not just what they suffered, it was the fact that they knew they couldn't tell. They knew that even if they screamed, no one would come, no one would save them. And then they learned to keep quiet, hiding, swallowing tears and disguising bruises. What was supposed to be a temporary home turned into a reprogramming field through fear. And the trauma, which many carry to this day, began exactly like this, with an amen. Over the decades, numerous complaints were made against St. Joseph's Industrial School, some by former employees, others by suspicious parents. But all met the same fate: shelving, denial, or transfer of responsibility. The power structure surrounding the Catholic Church in Ireland was virtually untouchable, and even when a local authority dared to investigate, it ended up facing a wall of obstacles. Documents disappeared, witnesses were discredited. The system seemed to work not to protect children, but to shield the perpetrators. The Christian brothers who ran the school not only ignored the complaints, they also frequently transferred the accused to other institutions. It was a kind of rotation of abusers. If a brother was being talked about too much, he was quietly removed and relocated to another unit, away from public attention. There were never any real consequences. The lack of punishment served as a silent license to continue. And this made the abuse an institutional routine, not an exception. Impunity fueled cruelty. One of the most emblematic cases involves Brother Norbert, mentioned in several testimonies. Students reported that he would beat boys for trivial reasons, such as forgetting to pray or looking a superior in the eye. Others claimed that he had a punishment room where his screams could not be heard from the dormitories. Despite the complaints, he remained active within the school for years. He was only removed after an external complaint. And even then, he was only transferred to another institution in Dublin. Without trial, without punishment, just relocated, like someone replacing a worn-out part with a new one. The most revolting, the state knew. The courts that sent the children to St. Joseph's received periodic reports, all positive, carefully manipulated. No mention of abuse, no evidence of irregularity. The church controlled the narrative, and the government turned a blind eye. It was only decades later, when the victims were adults and began to organize themselves, that the truth came to light. But by then, the damage was already done. Destroyed lives, irreparable trauma, and a question that echoes to this day. How many knew and chose to remain silent? In 1999, more than 100 years after the year, school opened. St. Joseph's Industrial School was officially closed, but the closure of activities did not mean the end of suffering. On the contrary, it was the beginning of a new battle. The fight for recognition and justice. The first victims who had the courage to speak out were discredited, labeled as bitter or disturbed. But as more and more former students began telling similar stories, an undeniable pattern formed: brutal punishments, systematic abuses, the same fear routine in different voices. The truth was screaming, and now the world was beginning to listen. In 2009, an independent commission led by the Irish government published the so-called Ryan Report, a 2,500-page document detailing decades of abuse committed in institutions run by religious orders, including St. Joseph's. The report confirmed what many already knew, but few dared to admit. Children were systematically mistreated, abused, and abandoned by the state and religious authorities. The shock was nationwide, and yet few of those responsible were punished. Most of the accused were either dead or protected by legal agreements reached before the investigation. Public reactions ranged from shock to outrage. There were vigils, protests, and open letters. The church apologized in carefully worded public statements, but for the victims, words were not enough. Nothing would give back the stolen childhood, the years of terror, the silence imposed. Some people received symbolic compensation as part of a compensation fund, but the financial amount could never cover the emotional wounds. What they wanted, above all, was to be heard, and finally, believed. The hardest thing for many to accept was the fact that all of this happened in front of an entire society. Neighbors who never reported, politicians who ignored reports, priests who covered up for colleagues. An entire system remained silent in the face of children's suffering. And when the truth finally came out, the only thing more devastating than the abuse was realizing how many people knew and yet did nothing. The collective omission was, for many, as cruel as the punishments themselves. For many of the boys who passed through St. Joseph's, the real punishment didn't end with the school's closure. It continued within them. They became adults marked by emotional disturbances, phobias, anxiety attacks, and a constant fear of authority. Many reported difficulty maintaining relationships, trusting people, or even looking at themselves in the mirror. What happened in their childhood didn't stay in the past. It grew with them. It infiltrated their daily lives like a shadow that never goes away, silent but present in every decision, in every nightmare. Psychologists who have treated former students have reported severe cases of post-traumatic stress. Some have developed self-destructive behavior. Others have developed drug addiction. There are cases of victims who have taken their own lives years after leaving the institution. The pain, suppressed for so long, ended up eating away at them from within. And the cruelest part: for years they were called liars, ungrateful, and troubled. Society, which was now shocked, was the same one that had previously looked down on them. The trauma came not only from what they had suffered, but also from what they had heard when they tried to ask for help. A few managed to turn their pain into a fight. They founded support groups and created networks so that other victims could find a safe space to speak out. It was these initiatives that pressured the government to formally investigate the abuses decades later. But even among survivors who became activists, the burden is heavy. The fight for justice often reopens wounds. Each hearing, each account, each memory takes an emotional toll. Still, many continued, because they knew that if they kept quiet again, the abusers would win, even if they died. Today, the St. Joseph's building is decommissioned, but it still stands. A few broken windows, empty rooms, silent hallways, a somber monument to everything that was denied, hidden, stifled. For some residents, it should be demolished. For others, it should become a memorial. But what no one wants to do is pretend it never existed, because to forget would be to allow everything to happen again. And the scars that time does not heal still cry out, not for revenge, but for memory. The story of St. Joseph's Industrial School is not just a tragedy of the past. It is a mirror, a brutal reminder of what happens when institutions gain more power than people, when symbols of faith are used as shields for violence, when fear silences victims, and blind respect turns into complicity. The children who passed through that school were not just abused, they were betrayed by their educators, by their spiritual leaders, by a state that was supposed to protect them. And the most frightening thing is to realize that this was no exception. It was politics. It was the system. The investigations revealed more than crimes. They revealed a culture of impunity, of omission, of institutional silence. While the boys suffered in Clonmel, others in Galway, Cork and Limerick were going through the same things. St. Joseph's was just one of dozens of industrial schools in Ireland that operated under the same logic. Domesticate the poor, discipline the deviants, hide the unwanted. In the name of morality, they tortured. In the name of God, they were silent. And society allowed it because it was easier not to know. It's more convenient not to see. Today, the Ryan Report is available for anyone to read, but few people do that. The truth is still there, detailed in pages that bleed with stories. However, most of the world prefers to forget. The scandal passed, the commotion subsided, the names disappeared from the newspapers. But for those who lived, time does not erase. And for those who are listening now, for those who are hearing this story for the first time, there is the responsibility to never normalize silence, because where there is silence, there is still danger. If you've made it this far, if something inside you revolted, if your chest tightened, then this story has served its purpose. It's not just about the past, it's about conscience, about justice, about ensuring that every child, anywhere in the world, will never again be left to a nightmare disguised as protection. That faith will no longer be a shield for aggressors, and that silence will never again be an option. Share this story, talk about it, because forgetting is the ultimate violence.